September 2, 1945. The sky above Tokyo Bay shimmered with a strange stillness, as if even the wind held its breath. Below, the steel decks of the USS Missouri carried the weight of history. Japan had surrendered, the guns had fallen silent, and a nation starved by years of blockade now teetered on the edge of collapse. In the ruined streets of Tokyo, families searched the rubble for anything edible. Roots, scraps, weeds pulled from gutters. Rumors spread like wildfire through the neighborhoods. The Americans were coming. Some whispered they would plunder, others feared vengeance. Yet what followed stunned an entire nation. On dusty roads leading into shattered towns, the thunder of engines rolled not with tanks, but with convoys of olive-drab trucks. The sight was so surreal that civilians froze in disbelief. Instead of weapons, these machines carried sacks of rice, tins of powdered milk, and crates stamped with bold white letters, U.S. Army. For years, American bombers had rained fire from the skies, leveling wooden homes and reducing cities to charred skeletons. Many survivors had grown up hearing propaganda that Americans were demons, monsters who would desecrate temples and slaughter innocents. Mothers warned children to hide if they ever saw one. Yet now, on narrow village streets where silence once carried only the sound of empty stomachs, the rattle of gears and the squeal of brakes announced a new, unexpected chapter. Soldiers stepped down from the cabs, young men in worn uniforms, helmets pushed back, sleeves rolled up. Their rifles stayed slung, untouched. Instead, they lifted crates, passing them hand to hand, until they landed in the arms of Japanese civilians, too weak from hunger to believe what they were holding. Food, real food, not scraps or weeds, bread, rice, even candy bars. The shock was palpable. An old man in rags, his eyes sunken from months of famine, clutched a tin of flour as if it were gold. A woman, her kimono patched and threadbare, stared in silence at the GI who handed her condensed milk for her child. Children, barefoot and trembling, edged forward, hesitant. A soldier knelt, pulled a Hershey bar from his pocket, and offered it with a gentle smile. The little boy reached out, his tiny fingers brushing the wrapper, as if afraid it might vanish. His mother gasped. This was not how she had been told the Americans would behave. These weren't conquerors. They were providers. Still, suspicion lingered. In bombed-out cities where shadows stretched across collapsed neighborhoods, people asked each other the same question. Why? Why would the enemy who burned their homes and took their brothers now feed them? The answer was not yet clear. But the truth, carried on the roar of truck engines echoing through valleys and villages, was undeniable. This was no act of charity. It was strategy, cold, calculated, but delivered with a human face. The Americans understood something deeper. Victory meant more than forcing surrender. It meant reshaping the soul of a defeated nation. In the villages near Yokohama, crowds gathered as convoys rolled in, their olive-drab paint dulled by dust, but gleaming under the late summer sun. Children trailed the trucks, shouting words they barely knew. Okome, pan, America, rice bread, America. The image etched itself into memory. A mother who once prepared soup from tree bark now cradled a sack of wheat. An old samurai descendant bowed low, hands trembling as he accepted rations from the very men he had been told to fight to the death. And in the silence after each convoy departed, villagers sat in stunned quiet, tasting American flour baked into bread for the first time, tears mixing with the salt of unfamiliar food. Nightfall brought another layer of disbelief. Lanterns flickered in homes, illuminating children chewing gum, their jaws aching from sweetness they had never known. Elders gathered in corners whispered of the irony, how the same industrial giant that had unleashed firestorms on Tokyo now brought nourishment with mechanical precision. But this irony, bitter at first, began to soften. Hunger, sharper than memory, demanded gratitude. Slowly, the demon transformed into something else, a savior in the form of roaring six-wheeled machines. The moment crystallized in the eyes of General Douglas MacArthur's men. Reports flowed back from the countryside. Japanese civilians were not resisting. They were not rioting. They were waiting. Waiting for trucks, for bread, for salvation that came wrapped in brown paper stamped U.S. Army. The soldiers themselves felt the paradox. Only weeks earlier, they had prepared for a bloody invasion that might have cost millions of lives. Now they stood in rice paddies and ruined streets, not with rifles raised, but with sacks of flour slung over their shoulders. In that surreal reversal, they understood they were not just victors, they were architects of something larger than war. For the Japanese, the sound of American trucks became a signal of survival. The whine of engines cutting through mountain roads carried reassurance. Villagers who once crouched in fear at the drone of bombers now ran toward the sound of approaching convoys. Every truck became a lifeline, every crate a promise that starvation might be beaten back. The imagery was undeniable. Steel machines that had once symbolized conquest now rolled forward as angels of sustenance. And yet, the disbelief persisted. Could this really be the same enemy? Could the men who dropped atomic fire now hand out wheat and milk? The contradictions tore through the minds of civilians, many of whom still bore the scars of loss. But as bellies filled, as children smiled with candy in their mouths, suspicion yielded to an unavoidable truth. Survival depended on these trucks. The Americans had turned war's deadliest instrument, logistics, into a weapon not of destruction, but of rebuilding. In alleys where paper lanterns swayed in the late summer breeze, in villages where the ground still bore the black scars of firebombs, the image repeated itself. American trucks, headlights cutting through dust, cargo beds stacked high, soldiers sweating under the weight of rations. Civilians stood in line, silent, respectful, still bewildered. And as the trucks pulled away, leaving behind footprints of rubber and generosity, one thought echoed through the minds of an exhausted people. The war had ended not with a gunshot, but with the sound of engines bringing bread. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation on its knees. The war that had begun with thunderous victories across the Pacific and Asia had turned into a slow, strangling defeat. For years, American submarines prowled the seas, cutting off vital shipping lanes. Bombers from the Marianas dropped destruction from the skies, targeting not only factories and military bases, but the very heart of Japan's cities. The country's infrastructure crumbled, its industries collapsed, and its population, nearly 72 million people, sank into famine. By the time the Emperor's voice crackled across the airwaves on August 15th, surrendering to the Allies, most Japanese families were already living on the edge of starvation. Food shortages had begun long before the final battles. With imports of rice, wheat, and soybeans strangled by the Allied blockade, civilians had been forced to stretch rations to impossible limits. Government-issued supplies dwindled to a handful of calories a day. People boiled grass, dug up roots, and stripped bark from trees just to fill empty stomachs. Malnutrition spread like wildfire. Children's growth stunted. Disease stalked the weak, and desperation seeped into every corner of society. The black market thrived, but only the wealthy could afford its prices. Ordinary workers and farmers, already exhausted from years of sacrifice, watched their families waste away. Japan's leaders had gambled everything on military conquest, believing new territories in China and Southeast Asia would provide endless food and resources. But Allied naval dominance shattered that illusion. Tankers and supply ships never made it home. By 1944, nearly half of Japan's merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The once proud empire, stretching from Manchuria to the Philippines, could not feed its own people. In Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities, the relentless bombing raids only deepened the crisis. Grain warehouses burned, transportation lines collapsed. Even when food could be found, it often rotted before reaching starving civilians. The final months of the war were apocalyptic. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo incinerated entire districts, leaving over 100,000 dead and millions homeless in a single night. Survivors huddled in makeshift shelters, their lives reduced to ashes and hunger. Cities became hollow shells of humanity. At night, families scavenged through ruins by lantern light, searching for scraps of rice or dried fish. By day, they lined up for rations that rarely came. Parents gave their portions to children, growing thinner by the week. A generation raised on promises of imperial glory now knew only despair. Yet even in defeat, many Japanese expected the worst from their conquerors. Decades of militarist propaganda had painted Americans as brutal invaders. Posters depicted them as beasts with fangs, demons that would enslave women and slaughter innocents. Teachers warned schoolchildren to resist capture at all costs. Mothers were told to arm themselves with bamboo spears when the Americans came. These images carved deep fear into the national psyche. The idea that the same enemy would feed the starving was beyond imagination. But behind the scenes, American planners had already drawn a different blueprint for occupation. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, understood that stability depended not on vengeance, but on order. The United States sought more than Japan's surrender. It sought to reshape the nation into a future ally. That meant preventing famine, restoring essential services, and, perhaps most importantly, winning the trust of civilians who had been taught to hate them. To achieve this, America turned to its greatest hidden weapon, logistics. The U.S. Army had mastered the art of supply during the war. Across Europe and the Pacific, victory was built not only on tanks and planes, but on an endless tide of trucks, ships, and trains carrying fuel, ammunition, and rations. No other military on Earth could match the scale of America's supply chain. It was this same machinery, once designed to feed divisions storming beaches, that now pivoted to feeding the defeated enemy. In warehouses from Manila to Okinawa, mountains of flour, rice, powdered milk, and canned goods waited. Shipments were rerouted from combat zones to the harbors of a surrendered Japan. Within days of the surrender, convoys of trucks and trains were rolling through the countryside, their cargo not bombs, but bread. For the Japanese, the contrast was staggering. Only weeks earlier, they had seen American firepower obliterate cities with nuclear fury. Now they saw American organization deliver food with machine-like efficiency. Where their own government had failed to protect them, the enemy succeeded. The message was unmistakable. America's power did not end with destruction. It extended into rebuilding. Every sack of rice, every can of Spam, every carton of milk was part of a larger campaign to win hearts, calm unrest, and show that the future belonged not to the empire of the rising sun, but to the Pax Americana. Still, the disbelief persisted. Farmers in rural areas, who had survived by eating acorns and wild plants, blinked in confusion as trucks arrived with wheat and sugar. Children in scorched cities, who had never seen chocolate or chewing gum, stared in awe at soldiers passing out candy bars. Women clutching their hungry infants wept openly when given tins of condensed milk. Even as they accepted the food, many could not reconcile it with the years of propaganda. The Americans they had feared as monsters were now handing them survival itself. The occupation was not free from tension. Some Japanese resented the humiliation of relying on former enemies. Others worried that generosity was only a mask for domination. Yet hunger had no ideology. A starving child cared little whether the food came from Tokyo or Washington. In that sense, the Americans understood something profound. By filling bellies, they could begin to shape minds. And as the first months of occupation unfolded, the image of olive-drab trucks rumbling into villages carried more weight than any speech or proclamation. Japan was still a nation in ruins, its streets lined with rubble, its people haunted by loss. But as autumn of 1945 settled in, one truth became clear. The war had ended not just with surrender, but with a new kind of invasion. Not with bombs, but with bread. And in that strange reversal, the seeds of a future alliance were quietly planted, carried in the cargo beds of American trucks. When the rumble of American trucks first echoed through ruined valleys and scorched cities, few understood the true scale of what was unfolding. It was not random charity, nor a simple gesture of goodwill. It was the unveiling of a hidden advantage, an edge that had quietly defined the American way of war and now revealed itself in peace. That advantage was not firepower, nor sheer numbers, but logistics, perfected to a science and wielded with unmatched efficiency. The United States had built a war machine, whose arteries were not just rifles and tanks, but convoys, warehouses, and supply depots that stretched across oceans. And in September 1945, that machine pivoted from feeding armies to feeding an enemy population. For Japanese civilians, the scale was incomprehensible. A single U.S. Army convoy could deliver more food in a day than their own government had managed in weeks. Olive-drab trucks lined up bumper to bumper, cargo stacked high, moving with the precision of an organism. Each carried crates stamped with codes, each crate catalogued, tracked, and destined for a specific distribution point. Soldiers unloaded not chaotically, but with practiced rhythm. It was the same rhythm that had fueled the island-hopping campaigns, where men stormed beaches, only because convoys had delivered rations, ammunition, and medical supplies beforehand. The Americans had fought the war on a tide of steel and sustenance, and now they wielded that tide in the streets of Tokyo and Osaka. The hidden advantage was not simply abundance, but coordination. Every truck that rolled into a starving neighborhood was part of a vast invisible web. Ships unloaded in Yokohama. Trains ferried supplies inland. Depots organized distribution with clockwork discipline. Radio signals, typewritten orders, and carefully mapped schedules ensured that no shipment disappeared into corruption or chaos. To civilians who had lived under shortages, ration fraud, and government collapse, this organization was stunning. They watched in silence as crates of wheat and canned goods flowed with a reliability their own empire had never achieved. Even at its peak, on the German and Japanese sides, during the war logistics had been fragile, improvised and constantly disrupted. Panzer divisions had starved for fuel on the Eastern Front. Japanese garrisons on Pacific Islands had withered to skeletons because the Imperial Navy could no longer protect convoys. In contrast, American forces had treated supply not as an afterthought, but as the core of strategy. A Sherman tank, a B-29 bomber, even a Hershey bar, all were only possible because behind them stretched an endless line of trucks, trains, and Liberty ships. And now, as the war ended, that same hidden backbone enabled an astonishing pivot, the capacity to feed not just armies, but entire nations. The psychological impact of this revelation cut deep. Civilians who had been told that Americans were barbarians now saw them as masters of abundance, children clutching candy bars, mothers stirring American flour into makeshift bread, fathers watching trucks unload rice into community storehouses. All of them felt the same quiet realization. Japan had lost not only on the battlefield, but in the ability to provide. The empire's leaders had promised strength, but delivered starvation. The Americans, once enemies, were proving themselves providers. In that contrast, trust began to form, not out of admiration, but out of necessity. And yet suspicion lingered. Some whispered that this generosity must have a hidden motive. Why would the conqueror feed the conquered? But the answer revealed itself not in speeches, but in the mechanics of the system. Convoys arrived again and again, day after day, with unerring regularity. Soldiers handed out rations not with arrogance, but with the weary competence of men who had done the same for their comrades, across 2 oceans. This was not a one-time spectacle. It was a new reality. The advantage extended beyond mere food. Trucks brought powdered milk to children, whose bones had weakened from malnutrition. They delivered medical supplies, antibiotics, bandages, life-saving materials scarce even before the war. In rural areas, tractors and spare parts arrived, helping farmers coax life from exhausted soil. Where Japanese infrastructure had collapsed, American engineering units repaired roads, bridges, and ports, not only to move supplies, but to rebuild commerce itself. Every delivery was both survival and strategy. The faster civilians ate, worked, and rebuilt, the sooner Japan could be stabilized under American oversight. From the perspective of the Japanese, the sight of American efficiency was humbling, even humiliating. Their empire had been brought low not simply by superior weapons, but by the invisible power of organization. The lesson was unavoidable. War was not won solely by bravery or sacrifice, but by the ability to move mountains of supplies at will. Civilians who once chanted patriotic slogans now stood in breadlines organized by their former enemies, realizing that survival came not from the rising sun, but from the olive-drab tide rolling into their cities. For the Americans themselves, the mission carried a strange irony. These were the same trucks and drivers who only weeks earlier had prepared to supply an invasion of the Japanese homeland, a campaign predicted to cost millions of lives. Instead, they found themselves hauling food instead of ammunition, bread instead of bullets. Soldiers who had braced for bloodshed now watched children laugh as they tasted chewing gum for the first time. Veterans later recalled how surreal it felt to step into bombed-out villages expecting hostility, only to be met by silent lines of civilians, eyes wide with both fear and hunger, reaching out for food. The hidden advantage was no longer hidden. It was visible in every street where convoys passed, in every family that survived another day, because an American truck had arrived on schedule. And in the minds of the Japanese people, the revelation grew. This was what victory meant in the modern age. Not only the power to destroy, but the power to supply, to sustain, to shape the destiny of an entire nation. By the close of 1945, disbelief gave way to reluctant acceptance. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon more decisive than bombs. Where Japan's empire collapsed under hunger, America's system delivered abundance. And as the rumble of engines echoed through cities still wrapped in smoke and ash, civilians understood that their future was tied not to the broken promises of the past, but to the olive-drab lifeline rolling in from the horizon. In the heart of the American occupation, effort lay not just trucks and convoys, but the intricate machinery of engineering that made them possible. To understand why Japanese civilians were stunned by the sight of endless supplies rolling into their starving towns, one must look beneath the surface, into the steel circuits and assembly lines that had transformed the U.S. Army into the most logistically advanced force of the Second World War. These machines were not simply vehicles, they were the embodiment of American industry, precision, and innovation born in factories that never slept, designed by minds that saw war as a problem of engineering as much as combat. Take the GMC CCKW, the standard U.S. Army 212-ton truck, the very vehicle that carried bread and rice into Japan. It had been the lifeblood of Allied armies across Europe and the Pacific. By 1945, more than 500,000 had rolled off American assembly lines. Nicknamed the Deuce-and-a-Half, it could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo over rough terrain, powered by a 91-horsepower inline-six engine. Its rugged suspension, six-wheel drive, and modular design allowed it to travel where railways had been destroyed and bridges had collapsed. To a Japanese farmer, watching such a truck climb a muddy hillside while carrying more food than his entire village had seen in months, it seemed less like a vehicle and more like a miracle, but the miracle ran deeper than horsepower. Every truck was part of a carefully calibrated ecosystem. Radios crackled inside command posts with SCR-399 communication units, ensuring every convoy remained on schedule. At supply depots, standardized packaging meant crates of flour, spam, and powdered milk could be loaded and unloaded with speed unheard of in Japan's fractured distribution system. Where the Imperial Army relied on manual labor and overloaded pack animals, the Americans relied on mechanization and efficiency. A single truck could do the work of 100 men, and when multiplied by tens of thousands, it created a river of sustenance no blockade or bombing campaign could dam. The technical marvels extended beyond trucks. Consider the rations themselves, engineered, tested, and refined for endurance. The sea ration, packed in tins, provided meat, vegetables, biscuits, and even coffee powder, designed to sustain a soldier for days. To a Japanese civilian who had survived on boiled weeds, the contents of a single American ration pack seemed luxurious. Or take the cartons of powdered milk, produced in Midwest factories, dehydrated for long storage and reconstituted in village kitchens. Each glass handed to a child represented not just calories, but science factories and the might of industrial America. Factories like Ford's River Rouge, General Motors' sprawling plants, and the assembly lines of Studebaker and Dodge had been harnessed during the war not for profit, but for survival. The CCKW trucks, the jeeps, the crates of spam, all were mass-produced with ruthless efficiency. By contrast, Japan's industries had withered under bombing, their capacity to produce even basic goods obliterated. The result was a stark contrast. American abundance was not only about raw resources, but about a system that treated logistics as the very foundation of warfare. It was this system that civilians now witnessed firsthand, reconfigured from destruction to salvation, and at the core of this system was communication. The same radios that had guided fleets across the Pacific now orchestrated relief operations. The SCR-508 and SCR-300 units, rugged frequency modulation radios weighing nearly 40 pounds, ensured every convoy could adjust to conditions on the ground. In war, these radios had allowed U.S. tank units to maneuver faster than German panzers. In peace, they allowed food convoys to coordinate arrivals, avoid bottlenecks, and keep supplies moving without delay. To the Japanese used to ration lines that ended in empty promises, this seamless coordination felt almost supernatural. The engineering marvel was not lost on the soldiers themselves. Veterans recalled how surreal it felt to load trucks, not with artillery shells but with flour, sugar and wheat. They had grown used to thinking of logistics in terms of destruction, how many shells could be fired, how many gallons of fuel consumed. Now they thought in terms of calories, children fed, villages supplied. The technical systems were the same, but the purpose had changed. The factory lines, the crate stamps, the serial numbers, the radio frequencies, all served a new mission, not to kill, but to sustain. Japanese civilians marveled not only at the abundance, but at the order. Every crate bore markings, codes and stamps that tracked its journey from an American port to a Japanese kitchen. Nothing was wasted. Nothing disappeared into corruption. For a society long accustomed to shortages, rationing, fraud and bureaucratic inefficiency, the sight of Americans unloading food with military precision was transformative. It was not generosity alone that shocked them. It was the realization that their enemy's strength came not from brutality, but from organization. And behind this organization lay names often forgotten. Engineers like Charles Kettering, who pioneered portable engine designs, or Motorola's teams who developed rugged field radios, had shaped the very tools now transforming Japan. Factories in Detroit, Chicago and Pittsburgh had poured their soul into war production, and now their products fed starving civilians across the Pacific. The true hidden advantage was not visible in the faces of soldiers, but in the ingenuity of countless workers who had never seen a battlefield yet determined its outcome. By late 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. Convoys arrived on schedule. Rations were distributed with precision. Children who had once cried themselves to sleep on empty stomachs now chewed gum, sipped milk, and nibbled on biscuits stamped Made in USA. And with every truck that rolled past, with every crate unloaded, the lesson deepened. America's victory was not built solely on weapons, but on the technical mastery of supply, the ability to project abundance as easily as it projected destruction. For the Japanese, the experience was both humbling and revelatory. Their empire had fallen not only to bombs and bullets, but to a nation whose factories, engineers, and logistics officers had turned warfare into an industrial science. And now in the silence after surrender, that same science was reshaping their lives, not through firestorms but through bread, milk, and the steady hum of truck engines rolling through ruined streets. September 1945. The docks of Yokohama trembled under the weight of arriving Liberty ships. Cargo nets swung in the sea breeze, lowering mountains of crates onto the shattered waterfront. From there, olive-drab trucks fanned outward, engines growling as they pushed into a country still smoldering from war. Their first major test came not in a battlefield, but in the ruined streets of Tokyo itself, a city that had been reduced to ashes by months of firebombing. More than 3 million people remained in the capital, many homeless, most starving. If order was to be kept, if chaos and rebellion were to be avoided, then the Americans had to do what the Japanese government could not, feed its own people. The first convoys into Tokyo became a theater of disbelief. Eyewitnesses described silent crowds gathering along the streets as the trucks rolled in, their canvas covers flapping, the smell of gasoline mixing with the faint aroma of grain and flour. Some villagers bowed instinctively. Others stood frozen, still haunted by propaganda that painted these soldiers as monsters. But hunger silenced suspicion. The first sacks of rice were unloaded at a distribution point near Ueno. People lined up, clutching bowls, baskets, even scraps of cloth to carry whatever they could. A GI, sweat streaming down his face, hoisted a sack onto his shoulder and lowered it into the arms of a frail woman who bowed so deeply she nearly collapsed. Around her, children clutched their mothers, eyes wide as they stared at the unimaginable sight. Food, arriving from the very enemy they had once feared more than death. Reports soon spread. In Yokohama, civilians watched as trucks formed long convoys, stretching like an iron snake across ruined boulevards. Each stop brought an eruption of relief and confusion. Could it be real? Could these supplies continue? Many expected it to be a fleeting gesture, a single shipment to soften resistance. Yet the convoys kept coming day after day. The Japanese Home Ministry, paralyzed by surrender, became a passive observer as MacArthur's men assumed control of feeding entire districts. The trucks did not simply deliver food. They delivered authority, proving to civilians that their survival no longer depended on Tokyo, but on Washington. The scenes repeated across the countryside. In Nagoya, children swarmed around American soldiers handing out chocolate and chewing gum, their laughter piercing the silence of a city where laughter had nearly vanished. In Osaka, where rice shortages had pushed families to boil weeds, convoys brought crates of flour. Villagers gathered in hushed awe, running fingers across the bold white lettering of U.S. Army stamped onto the sides. In one fishing village along the inland sea, old men who had once fought in the Russo-Japanese War bowed low as trucks delivered medical supplies, bandages, and cans of Spam, an alien food that would, in time, become a staple of Japanese kitchens. German intelligence reports from the war years had often noted American abundance with bitter envy. Now, Japanese civilians lived that reality. After-action reports from local U.S. Army units recorded the astonishment of villagers, who insisted on offering gifts, woven baskets, pickled vegetables, even handmade toys, in exchange for food they knew they could never repay. Soldiers, often no older than the boys standing barefoot before them, were moved by the sight of families breaking into tears over a loaf of bread. These were not symbolic gestures. They were moments of survival. Numbers told their own story. By December 1945, more than 600,000 tons of food had been imported into Japan under American direction. A single convoy of CCKW trucks could carry 250 tons in a day, enough to feed tens of thousands. When compared to the scale of famine, these numbers seemed small, but in reality, they kept a fragile society from collapse. In the chaos of surrender, when riots and uprisings might have erupted, the steady flow of food acted as a stabilizer. Japanese police reported fewer incidents of theft and unrest in areas where American trucks had arrived. In contrast, regions still waiting for shipments grew tense, their desperation boiling over into minor skirmishes until relief arrived. The disbelief of civilians became evident in small, intimate moments. A boy in Hiroshima, whose city had been obliterated by the atomic bomb, clutched a tin of powdered milk as if it were a holy relic. In Sapporo, farmers watched trucks rumble through mountain passes, their tires carving into frozen roads where oxen had once struggled. In Tokyo, a young girl pressed a Hershey bar to her lips, unable to eat it immediately, unwilling to let something so precious disappear too quickly. Soldiers wrote home describing the haunting mixture of gratitude and grief on the faces of civilians who accepted food with trembling hands. The Americans documented everything. Photographs captured the stark contrast of GIs unloading wheat while women in kimonos bowed before them. Newsreels showed convoys stretching through ruined cities, soldiers ladling soup for children in tin cups. These images were not just for record, they were deliberate symbols, proof to the world that America's occupation was built not on cruelty, but on sustenance. The propaganda of Japan's militarists, which had warned of American demons, could not survive against the evidence of children fed and families saved. But perhaps the most striking testimony came from the civilians themselves. Diaries recovered from the months after surrender speak of the surreal inversion of expectations. One Tokyo mother wrote, "I feared the Americans would kill my children. Instead, they gave them bread. I do not understand this world anymore." A fisherman near Yokosuka recorded, "When the trucks came, we thought they carried soldiers. They carried food. I wept, my wife wept. Even the old men wept." In the broader arc of history, these convoys were small compared to the battles that had preceded them, yet to the people who stood in line, clutching bowls and baskets, they were as decisive as any victory. The Americans had not only conquered Japan militarily, they had seized the very role of provider, the position once held by the emperor himself. And as trucks rumbled on, the disbelief of civilians slowly gave way to dependence, a dependence that would shape the future of occupied Japan and its relationship with the United States. Spring of 1946 brought both renewal and dread. Japan's cherry blossoms bloomed across cities still scarred by bomb craters, their delicate petals drifting through streets lined with rubble. To many Japanese, the blossoms symbolized endurance, yet they could not mask the gnawing hunger that persisted. Food convoys continued, but demand outstripped supply. For the Americans, the challenge was not only to move grain and flour, but to build an entire logistical system in a land stripped of its machinery, its shipping, and its railways. The trucks that rolled out of Yokohama and Kobe were the backbone of survival. But they were also vulnerable, and every mile driven tested the limits of a fragile occupation. The geography itself became the first obstacle. Japan's terrain, a chain of mountains surrounded by rough seas, was never built for heavy freight movement. Narrow mountain passes crumbled under the weight of 6x6 trucks, forcing engineers to carve new paths or repair bridges hastily with timber and rope. Roads that had never seen vehicles wider than a cart now groaned beneath convoys of dozens of military transports. Drivers described harrowing nights spent crawling along cliffside roads with no guardrails, headlights dimmed to conserve fuel, engines straining as they dragged tons of grain toward remote villages. Many trucks never made it, sliding into ditches or breaking down in mud. Mechanics set up roadside workshops, often dismantling one truck to keep 3 others running. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. The US Army relied on tankers that offloaded gasoline at Japanese ports, but global demand stretched supplies thin. Every gallon had to be accounted for, every convoy planned with precision. Commanders issued strict orders: no unnecessary idling, no unauthorized detours. Soldiers joked that trucks ran as much on hope as on gasoline. Yet the convoys kept moving, because to stop was to risk famine in the cities. Then came the black market, an enemy as elusive as any army. Desperation fueled theft at every level. Japanese laborers unloading ships slipped bags of rice into hidden compartments. Drivers were bribed or threatened into offloading portions of their cargo along the way. In Tokyo, gangs organized ambushes blocking narrow alleys to strip trucks of supplies. American MPs quickly realized that food, more than weapons, had become the new currency of survival. A single sack of flour could buy months of favors, medicine, or shelter. To counter this, the Americans armed convoys with machine gun mounts and placed military police at every major distribution point. Yet theft continued, sometimes by the very civilians the convoys were meant to save. The tension between soldiers and civilians was sharpest during these moments. In Osaka, a convoy was swarmed by hundreds of starving residents who attempted to tear open crates on the spot. Soldiers raised rifles, not to fire but to push back the crowd. Witnesses recalled the air thick with shouts and tears, the soldiers sweating under helmets as they tried to hold order without violence. Incidents like these haunted commanders, who understood that a single shot fired into a desperate crowd could shatter the fragile legitimacy of the occupation. Weather dealt its own punishment. The typhoon season of late 1945 had already devastated coastal areas, sweeping away roads and bridges. In winter, snowstorms in northern Honshu stranded convoys for days, their engines freezing solid in sub-zero temperatures. Soldiers huddled in their cabs, burning scraps of wood to stay alive until rescue parties arrived. Yet each hardship underscored the urgency. If the convoys stopped, cities would starve. And starvation, commanders feared, would ignite riots or even communist uprisings. The Americans also battled inefficiency within their own ranks. Paperwork clogged the system. Crates sat on docks, while officers debated distribution priorities. Some shipments went missing altogether, misreported or miscounted in the confusion of occupation bureaucracy. In Tokyo, warehouses brimmed with supplies even as nearby districts begged for relief. Critics within the army warned that the logistical chain was stretched too thin, that every delay risked undoing the fragile peace. Yet even in failure, the convoys pressed on. Soldiers displayed a kind of stubborn endurance, repairing trucks with scavenged parts, improvising bridges out of bamboo, and sleeping in shifts to keep engines running. One lieutenant described the mission as a battle without bullets, a campaign fought not against armies but against terrain, weather, and human desperation. The convoys became rolling symbols of both hope and fragility. Meanwhile, Japanese officials, stripped of real power, watched as their nation's sovereignty dissolved with every mile of American trucks. The emperor's government had once prided itself on feeding the nation, but now it was MacArthur's GIs who controlled the rice bowls of Tokyo and Osaka. This created quiet resentment, even among civilians who depended on the food. Diaries captured the contradiction, gratitude laced with humiliation. A farmer in Niigata wrote, "We eat American bread, but our hearts remain Japanese. How long must we bow to the hands that feed us?" For the Americans, the stakes went beyond feeding mouths. Every convoy that reached its destination without incident strengthened the perception of U.S. authority. Every breakdown, every theft, every riot risked undermining the narrative of benevolent occupation. The logistical struggle was not simply about food, it was about legitimacy. In the ashes of empire, sovereignty was measured not by flags or ceremonies, but by the simple question of who could feed the people. By the end of 1946, the Americans had moved more than 1 million tons of food through these convoys, a staggering feat given the obstacles. Yet the strain was visible. Trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Drivers rotated constantly to avoid exhaustion. Civilians grew restless, demanding more than the convoys could deliver. Hunger was no longer acute starvation, but it remained a constant shadow, a reminder of how fragile survival was. The story of these logistical battles was rarely told in grand speeches or official reports. But for the men behind the wheel, it was war of a different kind. One fought mile by mile, sack by sack, in a land where every delivery meant the difference between calm and chaos. And as the occupation entered its second year, both Americans and Japanese understood a stark truth. The trucks were more than machines. They were lifelines rolling through ruins, carrying not just food, but the very future of Japan. By 1947, the immediate crisis had eased. Cities once paralyzed by hunger now showed cautious signs of recovery. In Tokyo, children walked to school with bread rolls in their hands, food provided through American relief. In rural markets, stalls displayed sacks of imported flour alongside the first rice harvests Japan had managed since the surrender. The convoys of olive-drab trucks still rumbled through city streets, but now they carried not just grain, they carried the imprint of a new order. For Japanese civilians, the memory of those first post-war months would never fade, a time when survival depended on foreign soldiers, and when food became the most powerful weapon of peace. The legacy of those convoys extended far beyond calories. They reshaped the Japanese perception of their former enemies. For years, propaganda had painted Americans as monsters who would burn, pillage, and enslave. Instead, GIs arrived with sacks of flour, crates of powdered milk, and tins of Spam. The contradiction was jarring. Civilians whispered in astonishment that the same army which had dropped atomic bombs was now delivering bread. The trucks rolling into devastated neighborhoods became symbols of something larger than sustenance. They represented a shift from conquest to caretaking. Children were the first to embrace it. In diaries, many recalled the taste of their first American bread or candy, gifts handed out by soldiers at convoy stops. These small gestures carried immense weight in a society shattered by war. A single chocolate bar could transform fear into trust. Over time, gratitude softened hostility, and American aid became a cornerstone of the cultural bridge that would define U.S.-Japanese relations in the post-war era. The Japanese government, weakened but rebuilding, also recognized the political power of the convoys. Feeding the population restored a sense of stability that allowed reforms to take hold. Land redistribution, democratization, labor protections. Without food security, these measures would have collapsed under the weight of unrest. General Douglas MacArthur himself acknowledged that democracy cannot grow in empty stomachs. In that sense, every truck that reached its destination became a building block of Japan's transformation from imperial power to modern democracy. For the Americans, the success of the feeding program reinforced a broader lesson of modern warfare. Victory is not secured solely on the battlefield. Guns and tanks may win campaigns, but legitimacy and endurance are forged through logistics, through the ability to sustain both soldiers and civilians. The occupation of Japan became a case study in how food could stabilize a defeated nation more effectively than bayonets or bombs. Military theorists would later point to this experience as the dawn of hearts and minds strategy, a recognition that in the aftermath of total war, survival itself becomes the greatest weapon. On the ground, the convoys also left a lasting imprint on Japanese infrastructure. Roads expanded, bridges rebuilt, ports modernized, all accelerated by the demands of constant truck traffic. What began as a military necessity became the foundation for Japan's economic resurgence. The very routes carved by U.S. Army engineers would later carry the goods of Japan's industrial miracle. Civilians who once watched in awe as American convoys roared through their towns would, within a decade, see Japanese-made vehicles replacing them. The image of trucks delivering foreign food gradually gave way to trucks delivering Japanese products to the world. Yet memory lingered. Veterans of the convoys, both American and Japanese, recalled those years with a mix of hardship and pride. For American drivers, it was a campaign fought without gunfire, but no less dangerous. For Japanese civilians, it was a humbling chapter. Survival delivered not by their own government, but by those they had once been told were their mortal enemies. Many carried that memory into old age, teaching their children and grandchildren about the days when olive-drab trucks brought hope out of ruins. The geopolitical consequences were equally profound. Feeding Japan was not simply an act of mercy, it was also a bulwark against communism. In the shattered landscape of East Asia, hunger could easily have fueled radical revolution. Instead, American food convoys tied Japan's fate to the West, anchoring it firmly within the emerging Cold War order. In kitchens and bakeries across the country, bread became as much a political statement as a meal, a symbol of alignment with the United States, and so the lesson of those convoys endures. War may destroy nations, but peace is built in unexpected ways, sometimes in the rumble of truck engines, sometimes in the quiet act of handing a loaf of bread to a hungry child. The story of post-war Japan is not only the story of bombings, treaties, and trials. It is also the story of soldiers who became delivery men, of civilians who learned that survival could come from the unlikeliest of hands, and of a nation reborn not through conquest, but through sustenance. In the end, the olive-drab trucks that once rolled through the ashes of empire carried more than food. They carried transformation. They carried reconciliation. They carried the fragile beginnings of a partnership that would shape the Pacific for generations. And perhaps their greatest legacy lies in a simple truth. In modern war, as in modern peace, survival is the first victory.